Hello once again, everyone. So this is going to be a relatively simple topic for a video, but it's one that I was recently going over with some of my classes, and I thought I would go into it about detail. Now, I am wearing two swords. This will not be a video about doing two swords. Jake is very sad. But Jake is going to be helping me out in illustrating this prime parry, which is what this is all about. So what is the prime parry and why am I carrying two swords? So the reason being is that for first showing it, I want to not have a hand guard so that you can very clearly see what my hand is doing. But also it's worth noting that this parry exists in every single sword system, period. And it's always done with one hand. The reason for that is because you can't draw a sword two-handed. It doesn't work. So a sword, regardless, long sword, what have you, you could even argue some of the larger swords. You might have to do this. You end up in this position wherein you are parrying prime. Now the reason we're saying prime is because prime 1, right? More often than not, this is what's referred to as once you start doing numerical systems of guards. So 1, 2, 3, 4 to use the simple Italian. Sometimes they'll, well, later time, other times there'll be more complicated names such as guard of the head, or maybe sometimes high guard, sometimes hanging point, things like that. But the important thing about this is that what a prime parry is it's one of three things. The baseline that all of them have to meet is that the hand is higher than the head, and the tip is going either across the body, but more importantly, just forward. So I can go across the body here or across the body there, doesn't really matter. And then the hand can be in a variety of places, and also technically a variety of heights within reason. This position is assumed by default when you pull the sword out. To get it clear of its scabbard, you're pretty much going to end up in a position like that, and how it can be employed as a parry is by two factors. Number one, once I've just got it out here, if Jake just tries to cut at my head, there's a thing in the way. I didn't move at all. Now, depending upon how he's cutting at the head, we'll get to in a minute because those lines do slightly change. But just by default, right-hander on right-hander, this being here, I am safe. The other thing with it, and the other kind of default it gives you, is that because my tip isn't hanging straight down but has somewhat of forwardness, is you'll notice when those swords interact with each other, I am still getting a true cross. So what this is exactly the same as us being here. It's the same feeling, just inverted. And that will also play into it when we cut from different sides. So this is still the same general attributes of any bind that you could create, which is very good, because from here I can do a lot of safe things, and we're going to be talking about how to make this reliable in a second. But let's talk about how you open those different lines, etc. Because technically speaking, well, that by itself, pretty straightforward, pretty safe. You can do it kind of at the drop of a hat, and if you want to see it used sometimes, look at my Fighting from the Draw video. But the basic idea is you can take it a little bit further by also inviting certain places, because the hanging parry's other benefit is that it can parry any cut. So by default, the lines that a human being can cut on, with some exceptions of course being, straight down, from my right, 45, from my left, 45, straight across, from my right ascending, from my left ascending, and then straight up. However, and then of course there's, in theory, all thrusts go to the center. Those are the 8 lines that all fighters have to deal with. Now, depending upon exactly what cut he's throwing, I will make small adjustments to this parry, but by itself, I can catch all of those, including the thrust, with relatively minimal movement. So just to walk through that as we go. So firstly, we already showed on the dominant side, if he cuts down from his right, I'm safe. Now, if he cuts down from his left, I'll have to make some small adjustments, but nothing too crazy. It's just a slight pullback of my right hand so he doesn't catch my knuckles. Not too difficult. If he's going any wider than that, I really don't have much to fear, since going wider than this when my tip is here, it's just not going to go very well for him. Right? My arm is really not that big of a target at the moment. When he cuts up from his right side, that's when things get a little bit more complicated. I may want to bring my hand slightly more to me. Now what I mean by to me is I'm not bringing it across. That does start to become a different parry. If we're talking backsword terms, this is an entirely different parry. But what I am doing is I'm bringing my hand lined up with the left side of my head, which brings my tip closer to me as opposed to farther away. So go ahead and step back a little bit. Let's talk about that in detail. Basically, the temptation when the cut comes up will be to bring this over. And that will absolutely stop the cut. The problem is now I expose a lot in doing so. Instead, what I do is I just fold from my elbow to here, and naturally this gets a lot closer to me without me changing a whole lot. This will guide him up to what I want him to be. Now, if he's cutting super narrowly, like we'll talk about with the 8, that changes, but we'll get there in a second. So again, he does that cut from below, and I'm perfectly safe, just because I hinged on my elbow. Back. He cuts from his lower left against me. Same thing, just keep the tip somewhat firm. The biggest thing to look out for on this side is that I need to add a bit more extension with my tip. So what I'm doing is I am not trying to catch this cut flatly, right? That would look like this, and you notice how my arm wanted to drop to do so that I can open my shoulder and get more of my chest involved. That's fine, but it's running into the same default as this in that I open other things. Instead, the best way of thinking about this is almost like doing the exact same cut that he is doing. From here, as he starts to cut up, I extend my tip back at him, thus giving me a much stronger bind, and my hand can drop a little bit as necessary. Kind of depends on whether or not he's trying to go up into my face or take my ribs. Generally, because my arm is there though, most people are going for ribs. But then against the 5 and 6, so just across middle, you really have nothing to fear from here, right? It does not matter how strong he is. You're pretty much safe by doing the exact same things we already did. Now, the odd ones. This is the vertical line. Strictly speaking, you can get away with just using the hanging parry against straight up, straight down, but you have to watch out for something. So, if Jake does just cut straight up, straight down, I am pretty safe here. But there is room for him to work here. One, he could relax his hands so that the tip reaches over. That is something you see with the Scheitelhau or the Querhau, to use German terms. Another thing he could do is he could turn his hand to one side or the other so that the tip presents over. That can now turn into a strike or a thrust. So one of the things that you'll start seeing when it comes to dealing with prime parry straight down the line is moving into more of a horizontal blow. Now this would be basically St. George, for those of you who are familiar with backsword, and is the only modification I would recommend making in this instance because, like I said, since that factor's there, if I do this on the other hand, that's starting to turn into more like basically crono frontale. It's just in a horizontal plane, which is also very easily achieved from the draw. So I'm pretty safe here. Now when it comes to dealing with things straight up the line or a thrust, that's where the hanging guard can get a little bit more tricksy. So first we'll deal with the thrust because it's all the things I say for the thrust going to make sure for the 8. So, the biggest thing to watch out for is there is a terminus of effectiveness. So, I've opened up my line, he's coming with the thrust. All I need to do is do the same thing I did, bring my hand lined up the left side of my body, and boom, I'm safe. Now, Jake's hand is currently toward me. Another thing you may have to deal with is people having their hands not toward you as they thrust, where it curves around. This could cause you to be tempted to try and bring your hand more over. We just talked about why that's not a good idea. That gives Jake a route down the middle, either with his sword or with his hand. As such, a rule I like to institute is when you feel that temptation to push your guard over, move your body in one step instead. So I will show that very slowly. Basically what happens is we get to the point that I've made contact and now I'm starting to feel that temptation, right? Rather than doing this, as I feel that push coming in, I'm going to take one small step forward with my lead foot. Now his point is past me. I don't even necessarily need to grapple because that tip can't get in front of me anymore. I can hit him before he will ever get the chance to hit me. And if he's trying to grapple me or things along those lines, I am still giving him quite the rip, as Godinho would say. So, point being, when you feel that push, and this is kind of true on both sides, but especially on this, go in rather than trying to reach over. Against the other side, the same exact thing is true. He thrusts from there. Again, it's just a little bit of more firmness with the tip as opposed to letting my arm come back, especially on this side. The slight step forward gives you a lot of great, easy options. Usually it'll end up as a thrust as opposed to a cut. Achieves the same thing. Now in regards to the very rare but cuts coming straight up the line against you, you just need to treat them like thrusts. Unlike when we did St. George where I can catch things horizontally, I can't do that this way. Doesn't quite work with swords. Works with quarterstaffs, doesn't work with swords. So if he is coming straight up the line, I just need to push it to one side or the other. Generally, I find I like pushing to my right personally, but it works the same way either way, especially given whatever invitation you made. You then just do your respective follow-up. So, what Jake and I are going to do really quick is I'm going to go ahead and set this down and use the sword that's on my hip, but Jake's going to go through all those cuts as I call them out, and I will just use the same parry over and over and over again. So, I have drawn, Jake, and I'm in a hanging guard. Jake cuts from his right, I'm safe. Jake cuts from his left, I am safe. Jake cuts up from his right, I am safe. Jake cuts up from his left, I am safe. And even if it gets close, it's really hard for him to actually get through that. Jake cuts across from his right, I am safe. Jake cuts across from his left, I am safe. Jake cuts straight down the line at my head. I'm relatively safe as is, but I would be safer if I were here. Jake cuts straight up the line. Same thing as before, a little bit further than I need to. Jake thrusts from his right. And if I feel unsafe, boom. Jake thrusts from his left. And if I feel unsafe, and that's it. The hanging guard just defended against all 8 cuts and thrusts, and you're safe. In theory, if you also thrust along any of these lines, you could achieve the same thing. That's more rare, but does still occur. Now, what's the point of this? Does this mean that I don't have to learn any new parries? No. Right? There are 2 downsides of this. Number 1, any return blow I want to do is going to be slow. So cutting from my left, and this again is a universal thing, right? As soon as I've got this, whatever side he cuts from, I have to go the opposite side. So if I catch on my left, I must cut from my right, which means I have to turn over. Alternatively, the other way, he comes down from his left side or up from his left side, doesn't really matter, right? I catch this. The benefit is I only have to move my tip to get that hit. The downside is these are your weaker parries. So you're going to have to be very strong about them and then launch your hit if you want to be efficient about it. So they're really not all that great for launching attacks. It's also taxing on the arm to hold this. So unless you're in desperate straits for a minute, I don't recommend you try and rely on this. But let's talk about those desperate straits, because that's the other thing about this. And the reason that this video is why you should practice the prime parry is because it's great for when shit hits the fan in multiple contexts. The context we just went over is I managed to draw my sword, right? There's also even period writing, Raworth in particular says, if you know someone is cutting at you out of the dark, do this and you have a decent chance of being safe. Same thing may also need to be true in a different context. So one of the things that I had to do, and this was very, very exciting, is my hand got suppressed by somebody else. So I had to draw left-handed. Now, because my ball grip is not secured, I can't do that very efficiently, but this is one of the few things that I would recommend you actively practice left-handed for left-handed's sake. Not just for sake of completeness, but for this is a skill set you might actually need. Now the important thing to remember is that when you flip it in your brain, it's his cuts that matter, not my parries. So my default, if I do manage to get my sword, is here, meaning now is where I will have to slightly withdraw that basket / that guard to make myself safe. Now if he's cutting from my arm, then he has a much better chance of getting it on this side. But if he's cutting from my head instead, this is where it comes back into its own. So Jake's cut down from his right, he cuts down from his left. Notice that now I'm moving it lined up with my right side of my head. He comes back. He cuts up from his right. Not as preferred, might need to put a little more basket into it, but I still am safe. He cuts up from his left. Much safer on this one and much weaker for him. He cuts across from his right. No problem. He cuts across from his left. No problem. Now this is where it gets fun. He cuts straight down from above. This one is where there's an odd property. So before, I said that he has a window to mutate over, etc., do kind of whatever he wants to. When you're left on right, that window is still absolutely there, but it's a lot narrower. For Jake to hit me, he's going towards my right side, which is my open side, which means that my default becomes his closed side. It's very easy for me to hit here, which is one of the reasons you don't want to get into a bogan fight with a left-handed person. So, bear that in mind. You may not have to go to pure St. George lefty on righty, because there is an available window. But if he's strong, you should treat it by default. Either way, though, he cuts straight up from either side, sweep it across. I'm going to move when I do that because I'm not quite as confident with my left side. And then he thrusts from his right, no problem. And again, if I feel threatened, slight step in. he thrusts from his left. Again, same sweetness. This one feels really, really good because I get his closed off side. So that's why you should practice that with your left hand as well, because you may end up in that situation where your right hand can't draw, but your left hand still can. And pretty much every sword suspension system, you can still draw with your left hand, it's just going to be very, very narrow. Now, one more instance in which you might want to consider practicing, and again, this is like worst case scenario ever, is possibly drawing in a reverse grip. Now, for the most part, this isn't all that common, as if you have time to get your hand in, you should be okay. And certainly with a basket, odds are you will probably take that active second to turn your hand over. But if you're dealing with something more simplistically hilted, like an arming sword or what have you, who knows? Your hand just may end up on it when you were reaching for something else. In which case, this now becomes a really big dagger. Now, its offensive components aside, the second you end up in this grip, especially with something that locks your hand in, or panic, your hand is going to be locked in anyway, your only recourse is to close. I'm going to close with him as soon as I parry safely, and then I'm going to stab him, or punch him, or do whatever I need to do to finish the fight. But does your hanging parry still exist here? Yes, it does. Now, this is where we talk less about sword-style hanging parries and more about dagger-style hanging parries. So for the most part, if I just put my sword in front of me, I basically have the same hanging parry I did before, right? And it's actually plenty strong. The only downside being that I am not able to see my own blade when I do these parries. So the dagger equivalent, to just grab one real quick, if you've seen any of the sword versus dagger stuff, would be laying it along the outside of your arm. That's basically your prime parry. You can also sweep across. There is another parry like this, the head parry from Meyer, but as I will show in a moment, it's really only good against kind of lightish cuts, or thrusts preferably. So if he's going to cut at me once I've got my sword out, it's all about having that relatively lined up with my arm. Then I'm immediately into close range and probably just going to punch Jake in the face at the moment, because it's also in my left hand. If you can get your right hand across, you're not going to grab this like this. It's going to be in your left. If he cuts from the other side, that's where things get a little bit more scary, but not the worst thing in the world, just I'm hinging a bit more from my elbow. This is not preferred. If I have to do this, it's really not great, but it does give you some fun options to play around with. Mostly on, you don't want to try and close this, because what am I going to do now? He's going to win that fight. But if you're going to then fight from half sword, not actually all that bad. When it comes to his cuts from below, on this side, it'll feel exactly the same. No problem. Same grappling action. When it comes to it from the other side, again, no problem. This one, you're again probably better off going for something like a half sword or things along those lines, maybe a sword taking. Relatively simplistic. Across is the same thing, so we won't bother. Now, when it comes to the thrusts or the 7, that's where things get more dicey, because remember, the 8 is just like the thrusts. For these, you're better off keeping distance, as this works exactly the same. You see this in Meyer's dagger section. His first guard is basically this, and against thrusts, you just move one side to side. Pretty universal thing, actually. So if someone's going to thrust at me because I'm holding my sword wrong, I just bring it across, and this one, go ahead and bring it well across, because you can't reach as far thumb up as you can thumb down, and then do whatever feels best. That feels best to me, right? On the other side, the same exact thing is true. Just bring it across, do whatever feels best. When it comes to straight down, that's where things get tricky. You have two options. And again, I'm using a backsword for this. It could be literally any sword in your hand. So I'm actually going to switch my sword real quick. So that way you can see my thumb more clearly. So I'm holding the sword in the reverse grip. When someone's cutting straight down the line, you absolutely can still catch this way. Notice that I put my right hand up to reinforce, because no lie, this is going to suck a little bit. If you have a simple enough cruciform hilt that you can lay it onto your hand, that might not necessarily be the worst idea. It's not going to be pleasant, but I am not in a ton of pain comparatively. Now, that's only if I'm able to get the flat on my guard, in which case then we're into wrestling or what have you. If I can't do that, there is going to be some shock here when it hits, and that is just not pleasant. I'm telling you that right now. Not impossible, right? If I know someone's going to chop straight up the line, I can get closer and catch this much more to my forts. This is the same as parrying with a dagger, which is why I'm fine doing it without a basket. It's just I have then a bigger dagger to stab with. Another option, however, you may not be able to do that for whatever reason, is you can still do a half sword parry, mixed grip. Now, all the lifters in the audience are like, oh my god, mixed grip, what are you doing? But it's still the same. If someone's going to cut, you can still achieve this catch exactly the same. This is no different than parrying with an axe. And that's exactly what you should then do next, is use this like an axe. Either point in, or whack the crap out of him. So point being, you do still have a sort of St. George option, it just looks very different than you're used to. So, the prime parry, to sum up. It guards against all the cuts, and in theory, all the thrusts, but mostly just thrusts coming on either side. You have it across your body, you have it opening up your right, you have it opening up your left. All these things are achieved with just little movements of the hand and little applications of the point to one side or the other. Train it also on your left side with the same thing in mind. And then if you're really froggy, bear in mind how it still exists in dagger, as it can be very, very useful. Especially if you find yourself in a situation which, this is an odd one, but it can happen. Oftentimes when you take someone else's sword away, odds are it's probably not in a grip you were ready for. You may need to now fight someone off with their sword holding in reverse. I've seen stranger things happen. But either way though, thank you very much, Jake. And thank you all very much for watching. Hopefully you enjoy this odd little romp through the prime parry. It's one that's worth consideration. Not something that's gonna break any walls or amazing, but it is something to consider because it's universal for a very good reason. But otherwise, thank you very, very much for watching. We'll go over some other techniques another time.